Hi, I am just reading because I like reading, and I decided to try some nonfiction. I noticed I haven't done to try fiction because I have mostly been doing nonfiction. Did just try some poetry, but I have read the first couple stories in Arrival by Ted Chiang, originally published as Stories of Your Life and Others until Arrival, the movie, came out. The first story I read, and the first story I'm going to read right now, is about the Tower of Babylon, and I like that maybe more than I like the movie Arrival, which I thought was pretty cool. So this is the Tower of Babylon. Were the tower to be laid down across the plain of Shinar, it would be 2 days' journey to walk from one end to the other. While the tower stands, it takes a full month and a half to climb from its base to its summit, if a man walks unburdened. But few men climb the tower with empty hands. The pace of most men is slowed by the cart of bricks that they pull behind them. 4 months pass between the day a brick is loaded onto a cart and the day it is taken off to form a part of the tower. Hilalam had spent all of his life in Elam, and knew Babylon only as a buyer of Elam's copper. The copper ingots were carried on boats that traveled down to the Karun to the lower sea, headed for the Euphrates. Hilalam and the other miners traveled overland, alongside a merchant's caravan of loaded onagers. They walked along a dusty path, leading down from the plateau, across the plains, to the green fields sectioned by canals and dikes. None of them had seen the tower before. It became visible when they were still leagues away, a line as thin as a strand of flax, waving in the shimmering air, rising up from the crust of mud that was Babylon itself. As they drew closer, the crust grew into the mighty city, but all they saw was the tower. The entire city was celebrating. The festival had begun 8 days ago, when the last of the bricks were sent on their way, and would last 2 more. Every day and night the city rejoiced, danced, feasted. Along with the brickmakers were the cart pullers, men whose legs were roped with muscle from climbing the tower. Each morning a crew began its ascent. They climbed for 4 days, transferred their loads to the next crew of pullers, and returned to the city with empty carts on the 5th. A chain of such crews led all the way to the top of the tower, but only the bottommost celebrated with the city. For those who lived upon the tower, enough wine and meat had been sent up earlier to allow a feast to extend up the entire pillar. In the evening, Hilalam and the other Elam miners sat upon clay stools before a long table laden with food, one table among many laid out in the city square. The miners spoke with the pullers, asking about the tower. Nani said, "Someone told me that the bricklayers who worked at the top of the tower wail and tear their hair when a brick is dropped, because it will take 4 months to replace, but no one takes notice when a man falls to his death. Is that true?" One of the more talkative pullers, Lagutam, shook his head. "Oh no, that's only a story. There is a continuous caravan of bricks going up the tower. Thousands of bricks reach the top every day. The loss of a single brick means nothing to the bricklayers." He leaned over to them. "However, there is something they value more than a man's life, a trowel." "Why a trowel?" "If a bricklayer drops a trowel, he can do no work until a new one is brought up. For months, they cannot earn the food that he eats, so he must go into debt. The loss of a trowel is cause for much wailing. But if a man falls and his trowel remains, the men are secretly relieved. The next one to drop his trowel can pick up the extra one and continue working without incurring debt." Hilalam was appalled, and for a frantic moment he tried to count how many picks the miners had brought. Then he realized, that cannot be true. Why not have spare trowels brought up? Their weight would surely be nothing against all the bricks that go up. Bricks. And surely the loss of a man means a serious delay, unless they would have an extra man at the top who is skilled at bricklaying. Without such a man, they must wait for another one to climb from the bottom. All the pullers roared with laughter. "We cannot fool this one," Lagudum said with much amusement. He turned to Hilalam. "So you'll begin your climb once the festival is over?" Hilalam drank from a bowl of beer. "Yes, I've heard that we'll be joined by miners from a western land, but I haven't seen them. Do you know of them?" "Yes, they come from a land called Egypt, but they do not mine or ore as you do. They quarry stone." We dig stone in Elam too," said Nani, his mouth full of pork. "Not as they do. They cut granite." "Granite?" "Limestone and alabaster were quarried in Elam, but not granite." "Are you certain?" "Merchants who have traveled to Egypt say they have stone ziggurats and temples, built with limestone and granite, huge blocks of it, and they carve giant statues from granite." "But granite is so difficult to work." Lagudum shrugged. "Not for them. The royal architects believe such stoneworkers may be useful when you reach the vault of heaven." Hilalam nodded. That could be true. Who knew for certain what they would need? "Have you seen them?" "No, they are not here yet, but they are expected in a few days' time. They may not arrive before the festival ends, though. Then the Elamites will ascend alone." "You will accompany us, won't you?" "Yes, but only for the first 4 days. Then we must turn back, while you lucky ones go on." "Why do you think us lucky?" As I long to make the climb to the top. I once pulled with the higher crews and reached a height of 12 days' climb, but that is as high as I have ever gone. You will go far higher." Lagudum smiled ruefully. "I envy you, that you will touch the vault of heaven." To touch the vault of heaven, to break it open with picks. Hilalam felt uneasy at the idea. "There is no cause for envy," he began. "Right," said Nani. "When we are done, all men will touch the vault of heaven." The next morning, Hilalam went to see the tower. He stood in the giant courtyard surrounding it. There was a temple off to one side that would have been impressive if seen by itself, but stood unnoticed beside the tower. He could sense the utter solidity of it. According to all the tales, the tower was constructed to have a mighty strength that no ziggurat possessed. It was made of baked brick all the way through, when ordinary ziggurats were made of sun-dried mud brick, having baked brick only for the facing. The bricks were set in a bitumen mortar, which soaked into a fired clay, forming a bond as strong as the bricks themselves. The tower's base resembled the first 2 platforms of an ordinary ziggurat. There stood a giant square platform, some 200 cubits on a side and 40 cubits high, with a triple staircase against its south face. Stacked upon the first platform was another level, a smaller platform reached only by the central stair. It was atop the second platform that the tower itself began. It was 60 cubits on one side, and rose like a square pillar that bore the weight of heaven. Around it wound a gently inclined ramp, cut into the side that banded the tower like the leather strip wrapped around the handle of a whip. No, upon looking again, Hilalam saw that there were 2 ramps, and that they were intertwined. The outer edge of the ramp was studded with pillars, not too thick but broad, to provide some shade behind them. In running his gaze up the tower, he saw alternating bands, ramp, brick, until they could no longer be distinguished. And still the tower rose up and up, further than the eye could see. Hilalam blinked and squinted and grew dizzy. He stumbled backward a couple steps and turned away with a shudder. Hilalam thought of the story told to him in childhood, the tale following that of the deluge. It told of how men had once again populated all the corners of the earth, inhabiting more lands than they ever had before. How men sailed to the edge of the world and had sailed to the end of the world and seen the ocean falling away into the mist to join the black waters of the abyss far below. How men had thus realized the extent of the earth and felt it to be small, and desired to see what lay beyond its borders, all the rest of Yahweh's creation. How they looked skyward and wondered about Yahweh's dwelling place, above the reservoirs that contain the waters of heaven, and how, many centuries ago, there began the construction of the tower, a pillar to heaven, a stair that men might ascend to see the works of Yahweh, and that Yahweh might descend to see the works of men. It had always seemed inspiring to Hilalam, a tale of thousands of men toiling ceaselessly, but with joy, for they worked to know Yahweh better. He had been excited when the Babylonians came to Elam looking for miners. Yet now that he stood at the base of the tower, his senses rebelled, insisting that nothing should stand so high. He didn't feel as if he were on the earth when he looked up along the tower. Should he climb such a thing? On the morning of the climb, the second platform was covered, edge to edge, with stout two-wheeled carts arranged in rows. Many were loaded with nothing but food of all sorts, sacks filled with barley, wheat, lentils, dates, onions, cucumbers, loaves of bread, dried fish. There were countless giant clay jars of water, date wine, beer, goat's milk, palm oil. Other carts were loaded with such goods as might be sold at a bazaar: bronze vessels, reed baskets, bolts of linen, wood stools, and tables. There was also a fattened ox and a goat that some priests were fitting with hoods so that they could not see either side and would not be afraid of the climb. They would be sacrificed when they reached the top. Then there were the carts loaded with the miners' picks and hammers and the makings for a small forge. Their foreman had also ordered a number of carts to be loaded with wood and sheaves of reeds. Lagunum stood next to a cart, securing the ropes that held the wood. Hilalam walked up to him. "From where did this wood come? I saw no forests after we left Elam." "There is a forest of trees to the north, which was planted when the tower was begun. The cut timber is floated down the Euphrates." "You planted an entire forest?" When they began the tower, the architects knew that far more wood would be needed to fuel the kilns that could be found on the plain, so they had a forest of trees planted. There are crews whose job is to provide water and plant one new tree for each that is cut. Hilalam was astonished. "And that provides all the wood needed?" "Most of it. Many other forests in the north have been cut as well, and their wood brought down the river." He inspected the wheels of the cart, uncorked a leather bottle he carried, and poured a little oil between the wheel and the axle. Nani walked over to them, staring at the streets of Babylon laid out before them. I have never before been even this high, that I can look down upon a city." Nani walked over to them, staring. I just read that sentence. "Nor have I," said Hilalam, but Lagunum simply laughed. "Come along, the carts are ready." Soon all the men were paired up and matched with a cart. The men stood between the cart's two pull rods, which had rope loops for pulling. The carts pulled by the miners were mixed in with those of the regular pullers, to ensure that they would keep the proper pace. Lagunum and another puller had a cart right behind that of Hilalam and Nani. "Remember," said Lagunum, "stay about 10 cubits behind the cart in front of you. The man on the right does all the pulling when you turn corners. You'll switch every hour." Pullers were beginning to lead their carts up the ramp. Hilalam and Nani bent down and slung the ropes of their cart over their opposite shoulders. They stood up together, raising the front end of the cart off the pavement. "Now, pull," called Lagunum. They leaned forward against the ropes, and the cart began rolling. Once it was moving, pulling seemed easy enough, and they wound their way around the platform. Then they reached the ramp, and they had again to lean deeply. "This is a light wagon," muttered Hilalam. The ramp was wide enough for a single man to walk beside a cart if he had to pass. The surface was paved with brick, with 2 grooves worn deep by centuries of wheels. Above their heads, the ceiling rose into a corbelled vault, with wide square bricks arranged in overlapping layers until they met in the middle. The pillar on the right pillars on the right were broad enough to make the ramp seem a bit like a tunnel. If one didn't look off to one side, there was little sense of being on a tower. "Do you sing when you mine?" asked Laguna. "When the stone is soft," said Nani. "Sing one of your mining songs, then." The call went down to the other miners, and before long the entire crew was singing. As the shadows shortened, they ascended higher and higher, shaded from the sun, with only clear air surrounding them. It was much cooler than in the narrow alleys of a city at ground level, where the heat at midday could kill lizards as they scurried across the street. Looking out to the side, the miners could see the dark Euphrates and the green fields stretching out for leagues, crossed by canals that glinted in the sunlight. The city of Babylon was an intricate pattern of closely set streets and buildings, dazzling with gypsum whitewash, less and less of it visible, as it seemingly drew nearer the base of the tower. Hilalam was again pulling on the right-hand rope, nearer the edge, when he heard someone shouting from the upward ramp one level below. He thought of stopping and looking down at the side, but he didn't wish to interrupt their pace, and he wouldn't be able to see the lower ramp clearly anyway. "What's happening down there?" he called to Laguna behind him. "One of your miners fears the height. There is occasionally such a man among those who climb for the first time. Such a man embraces the floor and cannot ascend further. Few feel it so soon, though." Hilalam understood. "We know of a similar fear among those who would be miners. Some men cannot bear to enter the mines, for they fear they will be buried." "Really?" called Laguna. "I had not heard of that. How do you yourself feel about the height?" "I feel nothing." But he glanced at Nani, and they both knew the truth. "You feel nervousness in your palms, don't you?" whispered Nani. Hilalam rubbed his hands on the coarse fibers of the rope and nodded. "I felt it too, earlier, when I was closer to the edge." "Perhaps we should go hooded like an ox and a goat," muttered Hilalam jokingly. "Do you think we too will fear the height when we climb further?" Hilalam considered. That one of their comrades should feel the fear so soon did not bode well. He shook it off. Thousands climbed with no fear, and it would be foolish to let one miner's fear infect them all. "We are merely unaccustomed. We will have months to grow used to the height. By the time we reach the top of this tower, we will wish it taller." "No," said Nani. "I don't think we'll wish to pull this any further." They both laughed. In the evening, they ate a meal of barley and onions and lentils, and slept inside narrow corridors that perpetuated into the body of the tower. When they woke the next morning, the miners were scarcely able to walk, so sore were their legs. The pullers laughed and gave them a salve to rub on their muscles, and redistributed the load on the carts to reduce the miners' burden. By now, looking down the side turned Hilam's knees to water. The wind blew steadily at this height, and he anticipated that it would grow stronger as they climbed. He wondered if anyone had ever been blown off the tower in a moment of carelessness. And the fall, a man would have time to say a prayer before he hit the ground. Hilalam shuddered at the thought. Aside from the soreness in the miners' legs, the second day was similar to the first. They were able to see much further now, and the breadth of land visible was stunning. The deserts beyond the fields were visible. Caravans appeared to be little more than lines of insects. No miner feared the heights so greatly that he couldn't continue, and their ascent proceeded all day without incident. On the third day, the miners' legs had not improved, and Hilalam felt like a crippled old man. Only on the fourth day did their legs feel better, and they were pulling their original loads again. Their climb continued until evening, when they met the second crew of pullers leading empty carts rapidly along the downward ramp. The upward and downward ramps wound around each other without touching, but they were joined by the corridors through the tower's body. When the crews had intertwined thoroughly on the two ramps, they crossed over to exchange carts. The miners were introduced to the pullers of the second crew, and they all talked and ate together for a night. The next morning, the first crew readied the empty carts for their return to Babylon, and Lugadam farewell to Halalam and Nani. Take care of your cart. It has climbed the entire height of the tower, many more times than any men. Do you envy the cart, too? Asked Nani. No, because every time it reaches the top, it must come all the way back down. I could not bear that. When the second crew stopped at the end of the day, the puller of the cart behind Halalam and Nani came over to show them something. His name was Kuda. You've never seen the sun set at this height. Come look. The puller went to the edge and sat down, his legs hanging over the side. He saw that they hesitated. Come, you can lie down and peer over the edge if you like. Halalam did not wish to seem like a fearful child, but he could not bring himself to sit at a cliff face that stretched for thousands of cubits below his feet. He lay down on his belly with only his head at the edge. Nani joined him. When the sun is about to set, look down the side of the tower. Halalam glanced downward and then quickly looked to the horizon. What is different about the way the sun sets here? Consider when the sun sinks behind the peaks of the mountains to the west. It grows dark down the plain of Shinar. Yet here we are higher than the mountaintops, so we can still see the sun. The sun must descend further for us to see night. Halalam's jaw dropped as he understood. The shadows of the mountains mark the beginning of the night. Night falls on the earth before it does here. Kudan nodded. You can see night travel up the tower, from the ground up to the sky. It moves quickly, but you should be able to see it. He watched the red globe of the sun for a minute, and then he looked down and pointed. Now! Halalam and Nani looked down. At the base of the immense pillar, teeny Babylon was in shadow. Then the darkness climbed the tower like a canopy unfurling upward. It moved slowly enough that Halalam felt he could count the moments passing. But then it grew faster as it approached, until it raced past them faster than he could blink, and they were in twilight. Halalam rolled over and looked up, in time to see darkness rapidly ascend the rest of the tower. Gradually, the sky grew dimmer as the sun sank beneath the edge of the world, far away. Quite a sight, is it not? Said Kuda. Halalam said nothing. For the first time, he knew night for what it was, the shadow of the earth itself cast against the sky. After climbing for 2 more days, Halalam had grown accustomed to the height. Though they were a better part of a league straight up, he could bear to stand at the edge of the ramp and look down the tower. He held on to one of the pillars at the edge and cautiously leaned out to look upward. He noticed that the tower no longer looked like a smooth pillar. He asked Kuda, The tower seems to widen further up. How can that be? Look closely. There are wooden balconies reaching out from the sides. They are made of cypress and suspended by ropes of flax. Halalam squinted. Balconies? What are they for? They have soil spread on them so that people may grow vegetables. At this height, water is scarce, so onions are most commonly grown. Higher up, where there is more rain, you'll see beans. Nani asked, How can there be rain above that? How can there be rain above that? Does not also fall here. I will say the sentence right. How can there be rain above that does not also fall here? Found it. Kuda was surprised at him. It dries in the air as it falls, of course. Of course, said Nani. By the end of the next day, they reached the level of the balconies. They were flat platforms, dense with onions, supported by heavy ropes from the tower wall above, just below the next tier of balconies. On each level, the interior of the tower had several narrow rooms inside, in which the families of the pullers lived. Women could be seen in the doorways sewing tunics, or out in the gardens digging up bulbs. Children chased each other up and down the ramps, weaving amidst the pullers' carts and running along the edge of the balconies without fear. The tower dwellers could easily pick out the miners, and they all smiled and waved. When it came time for the evening meal, all the carts were set down, and the food and other goods were taken off to be used by the people there. The pullers greeted their families and invited the miners to join them for the evening meal. Halalam and Nani ate with the family of Kuda and enjoyed a fine meal of dried fish, bread, date wine, and fruit. Halalam saw that this section of the tower formed a teeny kind of town, laid out in a line between two streets, the upward and downward ramps. There was a temple in which the rituals for the festivals were performed. There were magistrates who settled disputes. There were shops which were stocked by the caravan. Of course, the town was inseparable from the caravan. Neither could exist without the other, and yet the caravan was essentially a journey, a thing that began at one place and ended in another. This tower was never intended as a permanent place. It was merely part of a centuries-long journey. After dinner, he visited Kuda and his family. He asked Kuda and his family, "Have any of you ever visited Babylon?" Kuda's wife, Alidam, answered, "No, why would we? It's a long climb and we have all that we need here." "You have no desire to actually walk on the earth?" Kuda shrugged. "We live on the road to heaven. All the work that we do is to extend it further. When we leave the tower, we will take the upward ramp, not downward." As the miners ascended, in the course of time there came the day when the tower appeared to be the same when one looked upward or downward from the ramp's edge. Below, the tower's shaft shrank to nothing long before it seemed to reach the plain below. Likewise, the miners were still far from being able to see the top. All that was visible was a length of the tower. To look up or down was frightening, for the reassurance of continuity was gone. They were no longer part of the ground. The tower might have been a thread suspended in the air, attached to either earth or to heaven. There were moments during this section of the climb when Halalam despaired, feeling displaced and estranged from the world. It was as if the earth had rejected him for his faithlessness, while heaven disdained to accept him. Yet he wished Yahweh would give a sign, to let men know that their venture was approved. Otherwise, how could they stay in a place that offered so little welcome to the spirit? The tower dwellers at this altitude felt no unease with their station. They always greeted the miners warmly and wished them luck with their task at the vault. They lived inside the damp mists of clouds. They saw storms from below and from above. They harvested crops from the air, and they never feared that this was an improper place for men to be. There was no divine assurances or encouragements to be had, but the people never knew a moment's doubt. With the passage of the weeks, the sun and moon peaked lower and lower on their daily journeys. The moon flooded the south side of the tower with its silver radiance, glowing like the eye of Yahweh peering at them. Before long, they were precisely at the same level as the moon when it passed. They had reached the height of the first of the celestial bodies. They squinted at the moon's pitted face, marveled at its stately motion that scorned any support. Then they approached the sun. It was the summer season, when the sun appears nearly overhead from Babylon, making it pass close to the towers at this height. No families lived in this section of the tower, nor were there any balconies, since the heat was enough to roast barley. The mortar between the tower's bricks was no longer bitumen, which would have softened and flowed, but clay, which had been virtually baked by the heat. As protection against the day temperatures, the pillars had been widened until they formed a nearly continuous wall, enclosing the ramp into a tunnel with only narrow light slots admitting whistling wind and blades of golden light. The crews of pullers had been spaced regularly up to this point, but here an adjustment was necessary. They started out earlier and earlier each morning to gain more darkness for when they pulled. When they were at the level of the sun, they traveled entirely at night. During the day, they tried to sleep, naked and sweating in the hot breeze. The miners worried that if they did manage to sleep, they would be baked to death before they awoke. But the pullers had made the journey many times and never lost a man. And eventually they passed above the sun's level, where things were as they had been below. Now the light of the day shone upward, which seemed unnatural to the utmost. The balconies and planks were moved from them so the sunlight could shine through. With soil on the walkways that remained, the plants grew sideways and downward, bending over to catch the sun's rays. They drew near the level of the stars. Small fiery spears spread on all sides. Halalam had expected them to be spread more thickly, but even with the teeny stars invisible from the ground, they seemed to be thinly scattered. They were not all set at the same height, but instead occupied the next few leagues above. It was difficult to tell how far they were, since there was no indication of their size, but occasionally one would make a close approach, evidencing its astonishing speed. Halalam realized that all the objects in the sky hurled by with similar speed in order to travel the world from edge to edge in a day's time. During the day, the sky was a much paler blue than when it appeared from Earth, a sign they were nearing the vault. When studying the sky, Halalam had started to see that there were stars visible during the day. They couldn't be seen from the Earth amidst the glare of the sun, but from this altitude they were quite distinct. One day, Nani came to him hurriedly and said, "A star has hit the tower." What? Halalam looked around, panicked, feeling like he had been struck by a blow. No, not now. It was long ago, more than a century. One of the tower dwellers is telling the story. His grandfather was there. They went inside the corridors and saw several miners seated around a wizened old man. "Lodged itself in the bricks about half a league above here. You can still see the scar it left. It's like a giant pockmark." "What happened to the star?" I guess they're all children now. "It burned and sizzled. It was too bright to look upon. Men considered prying it out so that it might resume its course. But it was too hot to approach closely, and they dared not quench it. After weeks, it cooled into a knotted mass of black heaven metal, as large as a man could wrap his arms around." "So large," said Nani, his voice full of awe. "When stars fell to the earth of their own accord, small lumps of heaven metal were sometimes found, tougher than the finest bronze. The metal could not be melted for casting, so it was worked by hammering when heated red. Amulets were made from it." Indeed, no one had ever heard of a mass of this size found on Earth. Can you imagine the tools that could be made from it? "You did not try to hammer it into tools, did you?" asked Halalam, horrified. "Oh, no. Men were frightened to touch it. Everyone descended from the tower, waiting for retribution from Yahweh for disturbing the works of creation. They waited for months, but no sign came. Eventually they returned and pried out the star. It sits in a temple in the city below." There was silence. Then one of the miners said, "I have never heard of this in the stories of the tower." It was a transgression, something not spoken of. And right now we're gonna take a break, and I will check in with you next time on the Tower of Babylon.